everyone. Welcome to This Is Not About Your Body. I'm your host, Jessie Nealand. And today I have a really fun guest. This will be Stefanie Michele, who's a binge eating recovery coach and a certified intuitive eating counselor. She also happens to be a former client and friend of mine. And I'm super excited to have you on. So welcome, Stefanie.
Thank you. It's surreal to be here.
Okay. So for audiences who are not familiar with you yet, I'd love to have you just do a little bit of tell me about what you do and maybe a little bit how you came to do it.
Sure. So I work with people who are struggling with the binge restrict cycle, because I struggled with the binge restrict cycle for decades and recovered. And after I recovered, I thought there was nothing more I wanted to do than to help other people through that process, because it is just a harrowing place to be. And I had to really relearn how to eat. I don't think I really knew how to eat since I was a kid. Intuitive eating was a concept that was really nice in theory, but I just didn't understand how to get there. How does a former binge eater get there? So my journey led to this journey, and I then discovered intuitive eating as the certification to become a certified intuitive eating counselor, and now I'm working on somatic therapy. So the onion layers keep peeling back as far as all the things that are involved in healing one's relationship with food and body image and ourselves, really, essentially.
Yeah, totally. Can you define for the listeners what a binge restrict cycle is?
So, okay. Well, first I'll start by talking about what a binge is, because I get that question a lot. What even does that entail? So a binge is not overeating in the way of I ate too many pieces of cake because it was just so good and now I feel really full. It's more like these episodes of eating, and it doesn't always have to be a distinct episode, although that is how the DSM will define it. But it's intense and excessive amounts of food that are eaten in a frenzy and in this spiral of shame and guilt. And shame and guilt is part of the definition of a binge as well. And it's sort of like your brain gets hijacked by something, which I will talk about, and you can't stop yourself. So you know what you're doing in a sense. Sometimes people will almost forget what happened, and they'll sort of wake up
like a blackout state almost.
Yeah. That wasn't my experience with it, although it is for some people. I knew what I was doing. I was watching myself eat and knew my rational brain was talking to me what are you doing? Why are you doing this? I don't want to do that. But that didn't matter. My hand just kept going and my mouth just kept chewing, to the point where I would become sick with food and then wonder oh my gosh, how did that all just happen? I didn't want that to happen. And then I would sit in the guilt. And then the restrict part of that cycle was okay, now what do I do about that? I need to compensate for this. What's the plan? How am I going to do that? Either via exercise, fasting. It can be through purging, in some kind of way. And then that cycle just goes on and on and on and on and on.
Yeah. So it's very chicken or the egg, right? This question of did you restrict so much that then you got out of control and had a binge, or was it the binge that made you feel so guilty that then you had to restrict? And that is why we call it a cycle and not a before and after. It's a constant, endless snowball.
Yeah. One feeds the other.
Yeah.
And that's why it's so impossible to break. Because actually, well, I don't know if I would say, because I feel like there is an order to it. So restriction typically happens first. And then we have the binge response. But what happens is that after the binge response, it feels almost impossible to not restrict. When you develop safety from restriction, you somehow make up for this terrible thing you've done. There is such a pull to do that. And there were so many times where I had therapists who were saying to me, in order to stop the binging, we have to stop the restricting. I shouldn't say so many, actually. There was one who said that, because everyone else was just basically trying to teach me how to be more moderate with my eating.
Oh gosh.
But I couldn't. I would binge, and then I would feel there is no way that I cannot now compensate for this. I just cannot sit with that. And so it just kept going.
Could you give us a definition of restricting? Because you defined binge, and I feel like these are words that just get thrown around a lot.
So restriction can be physical. I define it in three ways: physical, mental, or emotional. With physical restricting meaning that you're actually limiting the foods you're eating, or the amount of foods you're eating, or the time. So even fasting is a version of restriction, because you can't eat during certain periods of time. it could be like cutting out certain food groups. It could be even just portion control, like this idea of I'm just going to eat like a reasonable amount the next day, being read to the body as that means you have to eat the smallest amount possible. But mental restriction is actually just as viable. And it's probably more insidious than physical restriction because most people don't recognize that they're restricting when they're only mentally restricting, which is basically the idea that you shouldn't be eating certain things. Even if you're eating them, you could be binging all day long and still be restricting. You could be mentally restricted.
This is a huge misconception. I'm going to ask you later about other misconceptions, but this is a big one. The idea that like, I'm not restricting.
Yeah. Oh, I
like
hear
when
that
you're
all the
telling
time.
yourself that you're bad for eating or that you need to stop soon or that tomorrow stop, it reads as restriction. It has the same effect.
Yeah, because the brain is like, oh, I know what happens when we think we're not eating well. We're going to diet soon. Like, it's like, I'm ahead of you. I'm just going to cut to the chase. So it's just reading it. Yeah, exactly the same way. And for many years, I would say for almost a decade, I just binged. I didn't physically restrict, but I was actively mentally restricting every second of the day. I was constantly berating myself for the fact that I ate. And for a lot of people, this feels really warranted. Like, it feels like, well, I do eat too much. I am out of control with my food. What else am I supposed to think? I do have to get this under control. But there's such a delivery in that. There's like the condescension of that and the like, you better, it's like a finger wagging at you all the time. That is mental restriction. And that will also fuel the binge.
It sounds like, so I don't know, disciplinarian-y. I think of this voice as like such a little nagging disciplinarian, like, or like, I'm like imagining like someone basically lecturing you, it's like that kind of patronizing voice of like,
which essentially it feels like it's an inner critic in a way. It's that like, you shouldn't, and like,
maybe it's just your impersonation of it that I get this vibe from.
Yeah, that's definitely how mine sounded. And I was just like, and of course I'm like, well, then we rebel. Well, some people do. I think you got the compliance angle, which is the restriction. And then you've got the rebel angle, which is that like, you know what?
You can't tell me what to do.
And that is, that's a fire. And that's the battle. It's like this, do I want to listen and like do the right thing? And okay, I got to get in line. I'm so bad. And then like, what do you, no, I don't, I'm just going to get bigger and bigger and eat more and more and more and take up more and more room.
Yeah. Okay. So I would love to hear your thoughts on, so binge eating disorder is one of the eating disorders in the DSM-5, the diagnostic manual for mental health stuff. And you can also be in the binge cycle without having binge eating disorder, right? How do you define the difference?
Well, there's certain criteria for binge eating that's outright. Like I think it's a spectrum essentially. And I think binge eating can sometimes, for me, I used to say I just binged, even if it hadn't been quantifiably the amount that would say what binge was. I think there's a certain calorie. It's like a substantial, more than a certain amount of calories. Whereas, and I've had people say this to me, I binged like, and it wasn't necessarily a lot of food, but it was done in that with that sort of energy. So to me, like there can be binge eating energy and there can be like more just chronic overeating or compulsive eating that is more maybe a lesser side of the spectrum. But how I really think about it, and I don't really care whether it's diagnosed or not. It's more like, do you feel like there's there's times where you feel out of control around food and you feel like an incredible amount of guilt about that. And how much is that impacting your functioning?
So would you say that like people who chronically overeat and they're really bothered by it, like even if they're not fitting a lot of the binge criteria, would you call that binging?
Sometimes depending on the like episodes of it, but it can also be compulsive eating or it can be chronic overeating. I would call that more disordered eating. Where it's like more of that diet cycle followed by periods of time where people eat a lot more and they have the guilt around it. Binging is its own little, when you binge, it, like it's like, it's happening and you're like, whoa, like what was that? That was not a normal thing to do.
Now I'm so curious because I feel like I have a sense of out of control that I always imagine a binge. The like visual that I attach to it is the Tasmanian devil. You know what I mean? Like it's like a whirling out of control energy. Do you have anything that you would describe as like that energy embodied?
Totally. I mean, that is essentially what it was, more mentally, to be honest. I mean, it could be physically as well, because there's some, and I have I'm anxious. Like that was always my thing. Although no, I was also depressed for a while. So my depressed binges were slower, but like chronic, like throughout the whole day, like I just couldn't bear the thought of
That's
stopping.
Interesting. Yeah.
My anxious binges were like Tasmanian devil, like where it was fast and like furious and like, just like a whirlwind of chaos in the body, but also in the mind. And I think that would be true. The Tasmanian devil analogy would be true, whether I was depressed or anxious, like in my mind, it's like, oh,
Totally. Okay. So I would love to hear then, if there is any answer for this, what kind of person is most likely to struggle with binging?
Ooh. So, as I was like sort of alluding to before, it's almost like the restrictive disorders tend to be more people pleasing and compliant, which is not to say that binge eating can't be, because it absolutely can be. And actually, I find that people in the binge restrict cycle, where there's more an active phase of restriction followed by an active phase of binging, right? So there's active restriction happening that's not just mental, it's physical restriction is more of someone who has more of this rebel tendency, and that there's not as much compliance. There might be some, but there's something of a rebel there as well. Whereas binge eaters and restrictors, to me, anecdotally anyway, from what I see, tend to be people who are more people pleasing and compliant. I find that there's a lot more inner conflict in a binge restrictor. There's a lot of like, almost like two personalities, like the side that is like perfectionistic and really driven, and another side that's like, I mean, I feel that way. I feel like a true Gemini in that respect, where there's a side of me that's like that I can do all the things right and all the and then there's a side of me that's like, no, fuck it, I'm just gonna no.
So could we say then that it's like almost a lack of integration that is more likely to bring this out? Like that's a really interesting thought, that it tends to be people who have like pretty extreme versions of two sides of themselves.
Probably you could call it a lack of integration, a lack of reconciliation of sides. I think it's a lack of compassion as well, because
absolutely,
I demonized the rebel side of me for a long time, right? Because our culture will praise the side that's compliant and that conforms and does the right thing and pleases others, especially as a female. This other side of me was like, no, but that was not okay. And neither was like me just doing what I wanted, and me not listening to rules was not okay. So I internalized this as wrong. Like, who is this part of me? I'm scared of this part of me. I don't know. I can't trust that part of me.
So what I'm hearing is that people who binge restrict are secretly badasses, and there's just a lack of acceptance and like reconciliation with that.
Yeah, that's a great summary. That's how I like to think about it.
Okay, so tell me about the binge recovery process, the binge eating recovery process. What does that look like, and how do you help clients through like from the depth of the cycle into a place where they are like okay and safe around food?
Yeah. So it's breaking that cycle in that point we discussed earlier, where it almost feels impossible to do so. So it's after the binge, actually. So we don't want to start addressing it by the binges, because those are going to be that's a biological response that you're having to scarcity and restriction. So we have to interfere at the moment where we start restricting again. And so it becomes about, and this is the hardest part, is not following up the binges with restriction, which takes so much energy and so much safety, which is how I actually ended up getting into somatic work, because the felt sense of safety, the way you talk about body image not being about your body, in the same way that food is not really about food. It's about the way that we feel safe or not. And having support in that space. So for me, I actually started recovery on my birthday one year. And I was like, my mom made me this cake. She made me this coconut German. It was like a German chocolate cake, but it was vanilla and coke. Anyway, best cake in the world. And I was like, I'm going to eat this cake, and I'm not going to make up for it. And that was how it began. Right. So I had like a lot of that cake. And that's one thing I always tell my clients before starting to work with them is when we stop restricting, the body that pendulum will swing to the other side, and you will eat a lot of food. And we don't think of it of binge recovery like that. We think about binge
Right.
recovery as eating less food,
Yeah.
which eventually happens. But in the beginning, it's actually eating a lot more because
Yeah.
it's like being let out of a cage and like, you're not going to go back in now, which is essentially where you've always gone. So it is this process of allowing and not following up with that restriction. And that's the place where coaching comes in, because that is so hard. That is such a lonely and scary place to be.
So lonely and scary. That's a great way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah. So like holding someone's hand through that process, and like, which essentially is what I needed all the time, to be reassured that that was the right thing to do. Cause you feel like you feel like you're never going to stop eating.
Yeah. I feel like I've sent like 1,000 Voxer messages of like, this is normal.
Yeah.
This is okay. You're not eating too much. It's not weird. You're not alone. Everybody feels this way. Like, it's just
Yeah.
that constant feeling of like, how could this possibly be okay?
Absolutely. Which is exactly what you feel, because
Yeah.
it also goes against everything that you've ever been taught about food and
Yes.
moderation, even in binge recovery. And I've been to binge recovery, like treatment. And the
Yeah.
focus was always on emotions, actually, and
Huh.
like eating less in response to big emotions. And I couldn't deal with emotions as part of this conversation until the restrictions stopped. Then you can think about how emotions are feeding your
Yeah.
drive to eat.
Gosh, that's so interesting that that's like part of the sort of formula in recovery, in the recovery
Yeah.
space. Okay, so I guess, I mean, I want to reflect that like the work at this point when someone is starting to stop is, or rather trying to get out of the cycle, is to start giving themselves permission to eat, even binge, and then not restrict again. How, like, what tools, what steps, what, like, how do you see that play
Yeah.
out next? Because other than just like the meltdown of identity, like the complete lack of trust in reality, like all of those things, like how, like what tools do you use with clients?
Yeah. So one is, it is a bit mechanical eating. So I call it anchor meals. And some of my clients think I say anger meals. So it's like a bit Freudian, but
Right.
anchor. So with a binge restrict cycle, right? Like there's going to be a tendency to want to restrict on the fly. So I always start out by saying, okay, we're going to have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and 3 snacks. So breakfast, morning snack, lunch, afternoon snack, and that afternoon snack is so important. And dinner and a nighttime snack. And there's kind of we don't vary on that, because, and a lot of people will say, but isn't intuitive eating about listening to your body's cues? And it's like, well, yeah, sure. That's later. That's the goal. That's not the method. So we have those anchor meals built in non-negotiably, no matter how much you eat at each meal or snack, because if you don't, what you'll start to do, and anyone who resonates with the binge restrict cycle is going to know, it's like, oh, well, I ate so much at lunch that like,
Yeah,
I'm just not hungry. So,
yeah.
And the cycle will continue. And it's also important for like establishing a circadian rhythm with food, because the whole point is to reestablish trust with the body, and the body needs to understand that food comes reliably at certain times of the day, no matter what, in this unconditional permission kind of way, no matter what, how much we've eaten before. And that needs to go on for months before you sort of see a shift. And that's a generalization, but I mean, I ate those anchor meals for like 3 months at least before I started to notice any sort of change in the amounts I was craving, or even the amount of mental space it was taking up.
And how much were you binging during that time?
Gosh, I wish I'd written it all down, but I was still binging. Here's the other tool that I'll use. The difference between a binge and restorative eating, which would be sort of the method here, is consciousness and that frenzy, right? So you're talking about the Tasmanian devil, and a binge would have been Tasmanian devilish. When we talk about having anchor meals, you're allowed to have as much as you want. So it could be the amount you might have had in a binge.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
But you're having it consciously, and you're having it like more slowly. And one of the things we talk about is actually slowing down movements, because when you're moving really fast, your brain's like, something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong, and when we slow down, your brain's like, oh, something must not be wrong, because we're moving slow. Otherwise we'd be moving really fast.
Oh my gosh.
So I remember eating, like I would eat like the equivalent of 3 or 4 lunches during an anchor meal lunch. But I remember watching my hand like go reach for food. And I remember saying, slow down, slow down. And I watched my hand like bring it back. Maybe no one else would have noticed if you were watching me, it might've been
Yeah,
imperceptible to
sure.
you. But to me, it was like, oh, I'm like, right, I'm
Yeah.
allowed. So I'll have it. So the energy of that eating was different. So I probably binged. There were probably times I forgot that all went out the window and I just binged, but it was more about staying present and conscious as I was eating. So
Yeah.
the energy of it all changed.
I love that. That's such an important distinction. I actually give clients occasionally the nobody likes this exercise, but I give them the exercise to set out in front of them everything, like to be realistic about what this binge is going to be when they get the urge, set it all out in front of you and actively give yourself permission to work your way through it slowly.
Yeah.
And like, it is so uncomfortable because all they want to do is pretend they're not going to have it all, right? They're like, I don't
Yes.
want to lay it all out because then I'm giving myself permission to eat it. I'd rather just pretend I'm going to eat the first thing and then stop. It's like such chaos. But honestly, just to see it all and be like, Jessie said I'm allowed to eat this.
Yeah.
Like I have permission. This is not an emergency. And then you just eat is like night and day from the energy of an actual binge.
Yes, because you're taking away even the permission from someone else. It takes a lot of that responsibility of self away. So you almost get like a pass on the guilt.
Exactly.
You don't have to. And that guilt is such a driver. Really, the guilt and shame are at the core of this disorder. And so trying to address that piece is what you're doing when you're slowing down and when you're saying it's all out here and I'm allowed. Someone told me I was allowed.
Yeah.
No one's ever told me that before. Is a part of it. And that's hard. It's easier said than done. But it's a practice every day. And I think having support around this is so important because because we need a permission from something external, I think sometimes to begin.
So what does the process usually look like next? Like someone's been doing months, they've got their anchor meals, they're committed to eating with a little bit more like slow or mindful energy. They are just eating tons of food and starting to freak out about weight gain. Like what happens?
That's
then?
what's next. So what usually happens is that people will start to say, I'm noticing that I went to bed last night and forgot about my snack, or I noticed that I got full a lot earlier than I used to, or I noticed that I didn't want the extra slice of whatever, of pizza this time. And I did, and it wasn't like I was trying not to. So these
right.
That will happen. And I'll get this feedback, like, this is happening, all this wonderful stuff's happening. But at the same time, it's like my body I have outgrown my clothes and I can't fit in this. And now, so it's like, again, we've got these two sides of like, this is great and this is awful. And then it usually turns towards a body image discussion. And that starts to creep in, which is interesting because it's almost like the body is gaining weight. There is that extra level of safety in the body, which is allowing these other things to happen. But now we've got, okay, now how do I deal with this weight gain? And that's usually like the second phase of things, which I'm sure you could speak to all day long.
I will say this is often where a client finds me, is they've been doing the work and it may be working, but they have like lost their minds and need support because the thought of like, if I'm just going to gain weight to get healthy, is that even worth it?
Yeah.
And so this is where I feel like a lot of questions around, sort of unpacking fat phobia and weight stigma and like the false connections that we all learned between health and body size and moral superiority and body size and all these things. Like, I would say that's mostly what I see. I'm not sure if you see something different because you start so focused on food.
It varies. But we talk about body image in the beginning. When I meet someone, I say like there's weight gain involved in this process, much, not definitely, but we need to be like, are we open to that? And so if some people have said, I'm not right, I'm not there, in which case it's that's maybe a case to not work together. Because for me, I get that. And I did not recover until my desire to recover eclipsed just slightly my desire to keep my body small. Only a little, like just by a hair.
Yeah.
But it had to be that way because otherwise it wasn't working.
Totally. I would say more often than not, people go back and forth where there's like the eclipse is there sometimes and they're stuck on the work and they're like so proud of themselves for doing it. And then there are times, moments, triggers, whatever, where they're like, this is worthless. I'm going back to dieting. I can't believe I ever got fooled and that I was told this would be okay. This is obviously a horrible idea. Like I definitely see those moments.
Yeah, I do too. And that's where the safety comes in, right? Because when you're in that space, I would call that like a flood moment, right? Those moments where you see a photograph or you see your image walk by a mirror and you're like, oh, or you're trying on clothes and they don't fit anymore. Like that's when like the adrenaline and the cortisol are flooding your system. And I'll call this curtain syndrome, where it feels like someone's just pulled the curtain aside and now you see, and I can't believe that I have been walking around with this like thing in front of my eyes all this time. And now I see the reality and I can't believe I've been so vulnerable and so duped. This is where I'm like, okay, let's look at this the other way around and put like, that's the curtain coming in front of you, right? So if like all this time you've committed to this work, you have felt like this is aligned with what I want to do. I want to recover. And then this thing happens, that's when the curtain's coming down and you're like, oh my gosh, I'm now flooding with so much adrenaline and cortisol that I can't see clearly.
Yes,
you know what I mean? Like
absolutely.
And so it's kind of like getting through that moment and waiting for that to come. You have to be thinking with your whole brain to recover, right? And when you're primal, you're just panicking and you're just going to move towards the quickest route to safety.
So something I love in these moments is to like give the alarm bell messages from their perspective, to name the alarm bells, right? So it's like in that moment when you're flooded, in really any case, right? It's like your brain is going, alarm bells are like danger, alert, danger, alert. And so just to even like be curious enough to ask, well, what is the danger? What are they telling you is so dangerous? Or what are they alerting you to? And often the answer to that comes out as sort of like a frantic, like, a vomit of words or whatever. Generally speaking, when you actually get down to it, it's like the alert is like that I'll like overnight I'll become 600 pounds and like get totally out of control and die alone. It's like so dramatic and hyperbolic that once you actually name it, you can kind of be like, well, thanks, brain. Cause like, I don't want to die alone. Obviously, I totally see what you were doing there. Thanks for trying to have my back. I think we're probably good this week, but it's like to really name those moments and be like, oh, it's just an oversensitive alarm system.
Yes. Which you can have some compassion for, So like, oh, when you deconstruct it like that, it has a lot less power because you're like, oh, you're just overreacting. Oh, and you're doing it to help. I understand.
And like totally understandable.
Yeah, that to me is huge. Like being able to step back in a moment like that and recognize all of that going on, which is very hard to do without the help, right? Like being able to have that sort of space to ask yourself that question.
So what other tools do you use in those moments? Like, what would you say if you have anything else that like comes up often? What do you give clients, or how would you recommend someone who's dealing with this without support? Those moments of like, oh my God, I'm gaining weight. This process like isn't working for me, or I can't keep going. What do you offer someone?
Well, because I'm really invested right now in somatic work, right? So there's a lot of practicing. And for anyone who's unfamiliar, so somatic meaning like of the body, right? So, and this was something I used to roll my eyes out because all I want to do is think all day. Like I'm so happy in my head.
Yeah.
I just love it there. But it's really disconnected me from my body. And so realizing that my body can play a role too, and that I can spend some time has just led me to be like, okay, what is so uncomfortable here? When I get out of my head about it, what's actually uncomfortable here, and when you go into, into the chest or into the stomach or into even the legs sometimes, where there's a sense of like fight or flight that actually happens there, which is essentially what you're in, right? Like this fight or flight state. So when I talk to people around this, it's like, okay, what's going on? Like, where's the energy? And I think of it like that. And that's a tool. It's like, think of it like energy that, cause it's flooding it's getting you prepared to either fight something or run away from it. What do we do with that? Just think about, we're not making decisions about anything right now. You're not responsible for that at this moment. You can definitely think about it later, but right now, inside of a moment like that, like where does that energy need to go? And sometimes it needs to get like pushed out. And, as someone I identify with anger a lot. So I will get angry if I have a body image. I'm working with you. This came up tons. Like I had so much anger come up as I was reconciling my body, growing. And that was lots of unprocessed anger for lots of reasons. And that was all coming up. And I would feel like I wanted to hit something. Like, and I could, when I asked my body what it wanted to do, like, I was like, I want to hit something. But also it's like, that's that part of that rebel that's like, that's not allowed. Like, you're not allowed to like be giving,
right.
not like giving yourself permission. Yes, you are. Like, you're not, if you're not hurting anyone, like go, I have a client who has a punching bag in her office for that reason, to just sort of, and I have someone else who just like slams a pillow on her couch. We do it in session and she's like exhausted afterwards because there's this, but processing it that way and looking at how do you want to move the energy that's convincing you right now that there's a big threat right here and now, is one of the tools of getting through it.
So I think it's really important to acknowledge that the appeal of being able to outthink these issues and this like the binge restrict cycle in the first place, and also all of the emotions that come up as you're in recovery, like the urge to outthink them and use logic and willpower is incredibly strong and reinforced everywhere and also utterly useless.
Yes.
So
because willpower is, and logic, both are part of the, like, more your executive functioning. And when you're in a moment of a binge or a body image flood, you're not there. You're not in that space of your brain. You're primal. So it's not accessible. So it's interesting. I assumed that, like, that's what I mean. I would watch myself eat and I would say, like, why? Because I could hear the part of my brain that was logical, but it was like not there. And that's because there was a primal hijacking at that point. When you can see them as different, you can.
I would say that even just learning that they're different starts to invite a lot less shame and guilt and more compassion to the fact that, like, because something I hear a lot is like, why can't I stop this? Why? It's like they blame themselves for binging, or even I would say once they start to be like, okay, I'm going to like stop binging, stop restricting, they blame themselves for not being able to stop restricting. It's just all these things as if willpower and logic was way to go. So I feel like just understanding, like, we are animals and we have these like wired things in us that we just can't overthink, or rather we can't outthink. And so dealing with it through a somatic lens, like, well, what's going on in the body? What's the nervous system up to, is like brilliant and so helpful.
So helpful.
Such a vast world too of like what the options are to deal with.
Well, I think it's one of the doorways into self-compassion, because you're otherwise blaming your character for not being strong enough. And this is like, oh, this is just science. Like, this is just the way like my cells arrange in my brain. Like, to me, that was my way in, because I was like, oh, right. Okay. This is actually something you could explain through biology. And with like the Minnesota starvation. Have you talked about the Minnesota starvation experiment on this podcast?
Not on here, I don't think. Go ahead and share it.
So this study just helped me understand this from a lens of, so during World War II, there were conscientious objectors, right? So they were they were men, and they were sound of mind and body. So in order to be qualified for this study, they had to be like robust physically, be physically fit, and also mentally healthy. They had, clear bill of mental health. I don't know how you do that, but okay. Anyway, and so they put these men on, well, first they observed them eating a quote unquote normal amount of calories for them to sustain them for some time. And then they restricted their calories by about 50%. It's worth noting that the restricting their calories was down to 1,600 calories, which is still above most average diets. Yeah. But this was semi-starvation. They were walking and they were moving, so there was some calorie expenditure in that way, but they observed them for 3 months on this 1,600 about calorie diet. And long story short, over time, what they found was that these men started to obsess about food. They started watching a lot of cooking shows. They started getting really irritable. They started hoarding food. They started hiding food. They started chewing gum and eating mustard, like these strange behaviors that we see in who we would think about as anorexia now. And they became obsessed. Their mental health ended up, and their physical health ended up becoming really compromised. They lost interest in sex, all these things. They become very anxious. And even after the food was restored back to their normal amounts that they had started at, the behavior still persisted. So this was so fascinating to me. So it wasn't until they ate above and beyond where they had even started what had been normal and appropriate for their bodies in the beginning for months and months, that they begin to heal. But it's like this primal part comes out when the body when it's not getting its needs met. And that's where like they started getting really angry. They started fighting with one another. Of course, this is looking at like, this is a part of the brain that starts to get activated that is beyond that, you know, the parts of the brain that are otherwise and evidently more attuned and more in line, and, you know.
And this is also something I feel like creates a lot of guilt and shame for people in the binge restrict cycle, which is like, what is wrong with me? I can't stop thinking about food.
Yeah.
And like, literally, this is your brain being like, hey, babe, could you eat a little more? Like, that's it. It's the most normal survival instinct ever. There's nothing wrong with you. But it feels like, well, other people don't do this. Like, why am I so weird about food and everyone else is normal?
That's the interesting thing about working in this is you meet so many people who are saying the same exact things and thinking the same exact things, and everyone thinks they're abnormal because of course we don't have access. No one's talking about this at parties, you know, like no one's saying like, I think about food constantly, I can't stop thinking about food. Everyone's playing that off, but it's so normal. Yes, it's a survival mechanism. And I actually was putting my 5-year-old to bed, and she is interested in like watching these cupcake videos on YouTube, like, you know, where they make the cupcakes. It's really interesting. It's fun to watch. And I've been watching them with her for a few nights in a row. And I recognized, because it still doesn't get old to me, like being recovered. I was like, I remember that I would watch these things on my own, like just because I was so obsessed, because I wasn't allowed to have those things. And watching them made me want them more. And sometimes I'd have to turn them off. And now I'm watching them like, and that's not alive. Like there's no part of my body that's saying like, oh, go get, you know, it's more just like I'm watching the art of it.
Yeah.
And that's not because I changed as a person. That's because my body's needs got met. So it's not fighting.
It is so hard to convince someone before they start this process that will happen, that like literally just meeting your needs above and beyond, getting to a place of abundance. You won't be this person that you're so used to being, that this is not like who you are. This is a result of a survival mechanism. Yeah. But they're like, it doesn't feel like a survival mechanism. It feels like my everyday, you know?
I know. And it becomes that, and it's very pathologized too. I mean, eating is so pathologized. So it does feel like you're a gluttony. Like it just feels like you're a glutton. I used to think that too, that I'm just broken and I am someone who I'm too much of a foodie.
Yeah.
I'm still a foodie. Like I still love food, but it's just not urgent and obsessive.
Right. Okay, so give me a definition of intuitive eating, which you said before is the end result, but not the mechanism for getting there. How do you define intuitive eating?
So intuitive eating, well, first of all, it's not my own term, right? It's by Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch wrote a book, which is now in its 5th edition, I think, which outlines 10 principles of intuitive eating, meaning that it's more of like being in touch with the body's sense and it's actually not just the body. And I want to clarify that. So it also integrates the mind. Like it's not to say that it only is what your body wants. It's also a part of what your mind wants, but in an easy relationship with food where you have an instinct towards what serves you best. And that, because one of the misconceptions is that if I allowed my body to eat whatever it wanted, if I followed my body's lead, I would just eat cupcakes and pizza all day long, which might be the case actually in the beginning. And that is maybe part of that
during that recovery phase, but not forever.
Yeah. And at some point you can bring, you don't have to eat everything that crosses your mind just because you thought of it. Like you're allowed to integrate thought into it. But it's, again, the word safety comes up for me. It's from this safe place and where food is not like scary. It's more of being able to be in touch with your food and your body in a way that feels easier.
Yeah. So I almost wish that there was another word for it. It's just such a great phrase. I don't love the book that they wrote. And at this point, I feel like I often refer to something that is intuitive eating, but is not really closely held to their principles, because there just isn't another phrase, and their phrase is so good.
I know. And it's so well known.
Yeah. But tell me about like, if that is the goal, what would that look like? Like, how do you describe the sort of end goal of binge eating recovery?
Yeah.
What does it look like once you're sort of through the recovery phase?
So this is interesting because I actually meet, because intuitive eating has gained more popularity, people will hear about it and use it as an approach to recovery now. And I think that if I had done that, I don't know that I would have actually recovered, because I think that when you're
Right.
coming from a mindset of doing things perfectly or following a
Yeah.
plan, that there's this temptation to do that perfectly too. Whereas for me, what intuitive eating feels like was the end result of binge recovery, which does not resemble maybe the idea of intuitive eating being like some kind of perfectly well-rounded breakfast, lunch, dinner, and like a couple of snacks that look like, it's sometimes it's messier than that. Sometimes it's organized. Sometimes it lacks structure. Sometimes it is like, a bowl of cereal at dinner time, like sometimes, and that's not intuitive. And also there's times where I eat against my intuition, I guess if you could call it that, because I just do. But I think like it's a little messier, not messier. It's a little, it's more abstract than this idea of intuitive eating. And to me, it's just knowing, it's kind of having my own back when I eat, and eating for like very, like reasons that resonate with different parts of me. So it might be for taste. Sometimes it might be for stress. Sometimes like emotional eating can be part of intuitive eating because it feels safe enough to do that. But it's also not being afraid of vegetables anymore. It's not being afraid of pizza anymore. It's just having like a relationship with food where it's not the forefront relationship.
Absolutely. I feel like maybe because, body neutrality is like is the big thing in my work. I feel like food neutrality would be the closest way of putting how I think of it as well, because intuitive eating does present, I don't think they meant to present it like a really polished sort of get this right kind of outline for how to eat. But I do think it's how it reads. It's how a lot of people take away from it. And so then they feel bad and guilty again anytime they're like, oh, I didn't eat intuitively because I knew I should have eaten this thing, or my body wanted a salad and I went and had ice cream. And those are just moments where I'm like, okay, so neutrality would be better, because we're really just looking at a relationship with food in which there is absolutely no moral attachment to any of it. None of the food behaviors. You can overeat, you can undereat. Those are two human experiences. You can eat ice cream, you can eat, celery. Like both are fine and fit into a diet. So I feel like what you're describing as messy is really just making a little bit room for the humanity of a complicated human relationship to food in which there is no morality.
It's your second book.
Oh my gosh. Honestly, though, I feel like I do the same thing with exercise sometimes. I'm like movement neutrality, right? Like it's the same principle, but we apply it, and it just like makes life so much better when you apply it somewhere that has so much morality, screwing everyone's relationship with it up.
Yes. And it's also not to say it's like the moral neutrality of it, right? Because it's not to say that like you might have an opinion about ice cream. It might not feel neutral, it might feel delicious, but it's like the moral.
Or it might make your belly hurt. But it doesn't make you a bad person for sometimes eating it anyway and then having a bellyache.
Yes.
If we were to do this about like sex neutrality, right? Like it doesn't mean you have to have all the sex, and it doesn't mean you can't have any sex. It literally just means nothing you do or want or like explore sexually means anything about your character or your worth.
Yeah, it's basically just getting the self-blame and like the guilt out of it, like the judgment. It's taking judgment away from all of it. Was essentially what is like, yes, I think that's essentially what it feels like to intuitively eat, quote unquote.
And I think there's something too about like how much people want to pathologize themselves, like just the culture we live in and the way we talk about stuff. It's very tempting to pathologize. And a lot of this is also just taking the pathology out of it. It's like, oh, I've been eating too much lately, and that's not a problem. That's just fine. That's a thing I'm doing lately.
But then where do you put your anxiety? So like sometimes
where indeed.
Because it's such a great place to pathologize something.
Oh, it's so like, convenient.
This is where I need to.
Because everyone will agree. They'll be like, oh yeah, that is bad.
Yeah, deal with that. You'll get lots of reinforcement.
So okay. I was going to ask you for some other misconceptions about intuitive eating, but now I kind of want to ask you about the anxiety thing. So, okay, we'll do this quick. So, what are some other, well, actually I have like a list of questions that I wrote down that a lot of people ask about it. But also, do you have any misconceptions off the top of your head that like a certain person who hasn't actually read it or gone deep into it might have an idea that isn't true?
Mostly it's that intuitive eating means that you can eat and should eat whatever you want, whenever you want, in like carte blanche. Like it's more of a permission to binge is how I actually describe it. It sounds like it's permission to binge, and that's not what it is. It's actually, it is a process of becoming more attuned, and it's not something you just start. It's not something that you decide you're going to be an intuitive eater. And now I'm not judging food anymore. So I should be able to be an intuitive eater. It's actually like I said, it's an end process rather than
that's super
method.
helpful way of framing it for sure. And also, but isn't it kind of like permission to binge? It's like, if you take the morality out of it, it's like, I can binge and I will binge sometimes because that's who I am and what I'm dealing with, but that doesn't mean anything about me and I don't have to restrict. Like, if you think about it that way, it's kind of permission, but maybe that's not what people are imagining.
Yeah, I think it's just like, because some people will take that and say, and just continue to binge to play out whatever it is that they're playing out through food and and like that's the goal. Like, the goal isn't to binge with permission. The goal is to be able to eat with permission. If binging is like something that's like a vehicle to expressing their pain, then it's not the goal to do that. It is neutral, but that's not the goal of it.
Yeah. So, okay, tell me a little bit about that then. Like, what is the relationship between like coping with pain or anxiety or any of these things that don't feel tolerable and the binge restrict cycle? Like, when you're trying to get to the real thing that it's about, if it's not about food, how does that usually look, or how do you help people identify that?
So usually it's around where that restriction started, typically, right? So for myself, I can just I remember when I started to restrict, where that impetus to control my body started. I'm going to look there around like what was going on around in my life then. What were those emotions that I felt I couldn't deal with? Because we'll store them. Especially if this is something that starts in childhood or adolescence, right? Like we need something to cope. So sometimes it's like, I feel out of control in my life, or I feel like I need to, not take up so much room because I'm just, I'm too much for my parents or whatever it might be. And then we start playing that out through restriction, and then binging is that response to the restriction, right? So looking at where that restriction started and what it was we were trying to cut off, because essentially when we restrict, right, we're also cutting off hunger signals. We're learning how to dissociate from our body. And so what was going on there? And usually, for anyone who's read the book Burnout, it talks about like the stress cycle, where the stressor, because the trigger happens, we enter the stress cycle, and in order to cope, in order to resolve that trigger, that initial stress cycle, we will use food. And we might, as adults, have different, logically, we might understand, I can handle feeling like I'm disappointed in my parents now. Maybe we don't, but like, there might be like some new ideas, but that it gets stuck in the body that like, nope, this is the way out. This is the way out of that. This is the way out of that. And so I like to look at like where that began and what are the triggers now that might resemble which of those activated wounds are getting reactivated right now.
Is Burnout Emily Nagoski?
Yeah, and her sister.
Yeah, and her sister
Amelia. Sorry, Amelia.
Yeah, that's fair. I should know that too. Okay, so by dealing with where the restriction started, you get to the root cause of the cycle and how it's been how you've been using it to cope, avoid things, earn things, protect yourself from things, all of these things. But what about the fact that like the binge itself also becomes a coping mechanism?
Yes, it does. So usually the binge, most everyone I talk to who binge eats, I would say everyone, I can't think of an exception at the moment. There might be though. Has a binge begin without a restriction first, right? So like the binge becomes a part of the response, but then it starts to take on a life of its own, because it's such a nice place to escape and to get some dopamine. And this is the other piece of it, right? So as our binge restrict cycle gets longer and longer, we start to feel worse and worse about ourselves. And then we start crowding out our lives, right? We start crowding out any other sources of pleasure or happiness or safety, or, because it all becomes about the food. And then we really do need that binge to provide us with a hit of feeling.
So give me some of the things that the binge can provide or stand in for, like as a need or tell me about the benefits, if you will, of the benefits
of binging. Boundaries. So where we're not able to set them out loud or externally, it's like a way of like it's the anger of the bound of like, no, it's like, no, I'm not going to comply anymore with the
Like an
restriction.
expression of the rebel side, you mean?
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. Safety and comfort. It is like food is comforting from the moment we are born, food is comforting and safe and reward for a lot of people. It's like, because we learn it's a reward as well, right? We learn from a young age that that's like, you earn your food. So it can feel like validation. I'll meet a lot of people who say like, they're not seen. I mean, I work with a single mom who feels like at the end of the day, like nobody, like she's done all this stuff and also, and at the end of the day, it's like that food is like her validation for a day well done.
Yes.
And it feels like
pleasure. Just
pleasure.
if you don't have a lot of sources of pleasure or joy, like it can easily take over for that.
Yeah.
You mentioned dopamine, which would be joy, happiness. What do you call dopamine? Pleasure?
Like pat on the back, like it's the accomplishment, like, and I mean, yeah, it intersects with joy as well. It's
like reward.
Yeah, reward.
Okay.
I feel like there's no like loneliness. Loneliness is a big one where food is just that reliable. It's always there. It's consistent, and it's also like a numbing agent too. For as much as it can be it can be either like numbing or it can make you feel. Because when you're so full, you're like, oh my gosh, I can't help but feel my body.
100%. I feel like my experience of binging, which was never like a major cycle, but certainly it existed. And in particular when I was dieting. But I feel like I ate to get rid of feelings that were uncomfortable. It's the same reason I like drink too much sometimes or shop too much. Like it was that coping, numbing thing that I just like have no longer having that, I've found other ways. I scroll too much or, I think we all numb so many different ways, but it can be a wildly convenient way of like, I know in 40 minutes, I will no longer feel any of these feelings because I'll be so stuffed with food.
Yes. It numbs it out. It's sensory, right? So food is like pretty much hits all of the senses, and senses are how our nervous system calms down.
Yeah.
So it's always available. We need like, it's the most convenient thing to use. Absolutely. And it's got the reward in it. So, I mean, like I always say, like people are like, why can't I just, call that friend instead of like, because it's not even close to the
Shouldn't
same
I be able to meditate or go for a walk? I'm like, I mean, if you can,
fun.
sure, but it's not going to take over and be like better.
It's never better.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a sensory tool too.
So speaking of it never being better, what are your thoughts on someone who is trying to replace the whatever the binge is giving them? They're like, okay, so I've acknowledged that I'm lonely or I'm stressed or I'm feeling too many feelings, and I use food XYZ. So how do you help them replace it when you know full well that nothing will ever just stand in and be that? I mean, it has been built up as like the one tool to rein them all,
Yes. So I say that we're gonna we work on other tools not to replace it, but to add to it. So when you believe that you have to, like, again, that idea of a bubble bath, right? If you think that if like you need to go take a bubble bath instead of binging, you're not gonna get that far. You're never gonna think about the bubble bath. You're like, no way, that's just not as good. So we're gonna do both. It's also not a bubble bath, but like it could be, I suppose, if you're doing like bubble baths. But it's bringing in new tools alongside of the food so that you have time to like safely explore them and integrate them in where they're not threatening to take something away from you, because it's like taking away your blankie, you know what I mean? Like,
that's such a great analogy.
Yeah. So
like you might give a kid a whole bunch of other things and lessen the power of the blankie over their lives, but like just trying to snatch the blankie away and be like, figure it out is like not going to be a good deal.
Here's your new teddy bear. Yeah. It's not, so it has to be done slowly and safely. That's why so sometimes people will meet with me for the first time and say, I've been binging up until this meeting. Like I've noticed this week, it's gotten really intense. And the idea always, I should warn people first, is like, I think like feeling like I'm going to stop the binges. Like I'm going to take them away.
And they feel like because they signed up to work with you, they're about to be lectured.
They're going to lose something
and told not to do it. Yeah.
So it's kind of like, no, we're going to keep eating. We're going to keep eating and eating. And we're going to talk about some other things too, and bring in these other things. And only when you feel safe And that's the thing is it doesn't become a choice to say, I decided I don't need the binges anymore. I'm going to go for this. It's much more organic than that. It becomes more like, I realized I didn't need to do that today. Like it wasn't, the urge wasn't there. I'm relying on these other things. Of course, this is wrapped up in a bow. This is in theory how wonderfully it works, but it's usually very messy to get to that point. But it is about expanding your sources of coping skills and joy and things like that, but usually with food itself first. And that takes time.
Yeah. I mean, even just building up these tools, these skills takes an immense amount of time. It's like, think about how long in therapy you would have to spend like learning how to cope. If you didn't have a stand-in, like an addiction or a binge restrict cycle or something, like it would still take a really long time because that's just an incredibly difficult thing to learn.
Yeah.
But when you have something that you're hoping it replaces soon, the pressure feels very high to be like, when will this work? And like, it just takes a long time.
It does, like years even. And that's not to say it can't, like there's other things that can't take less time, but this is not like a light subject. This is like, and I remember you asking me once, you introducing a topic like that to me and just opening up like the question in my mind, and I had no answers for it. Like what else do I enjoy? I don't even know. But it was just like, oh, well, now I'm going to be thinking about that for a long, long time. I still think about that. It's like, it's not like a quick thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I sometimes feel too, I mean, I give this analogy, which is like maybe slightly insensitive, but it really helpful, I find. Like if you just think about drug addiction, and I don't know if you've ever known anybody who had gotten clean from or gotten through recovery from heroin, but they will straight up tell you nothing is ever as good as heroin ever again.
Yeah.
And so I also think there's something like existentially really interesting about just having accidentally found out that there is this like incredible substance that will probably kill you, but also like nobody else was walking around with that torture of like, this exists and I know it exists and I'm choosing not to do it. Like there's something about that too with eating disorders and things like that, where you just kind of have to like reconcile the fact that you know a secret. And like not everybody is walking around going, oh, this would be so much easier if I could just diet and then throw up or whatever, like, but you do, I know. And just holding that and being like, I'm not going to choose it anyway. But does that feeling ever go away? Are you ever like, this nice little walk is definitely as good?
You know what? That's a great question. And I think that in the beginning, this is more potent. I think in the beginning, it's a lot harder to say, I'm actively not choosing this thing that I know would feel better. But I was just talking to somebody about this recently because I was talking about how I was, you could take this as you will. I was like, I'm going to watch The Crown tonight. Like I was so excited to watch The Crown, right? This was my hit of dopamine. And I was thinking like, oh my gosh, it's so sad that like my excitement is now, but it doesn't feel like I don't feel like, like I'd rather be binging. Like to me, it's like, it's just replaced it. It's a little more subtle. It's definitely not as fancy and it's, it doesn't have those bells and whistles attached to it, but it's still like, it does provide me with this like, yay, comfort. Like it is comforting to me. And I don't miss the food being that thing, but in the beginning I would have.
That makes so much sense. I would say that similarly, I think what's helpful about the analogy there is knowing that there's a possibility it doesn't go away. And that like, there are people doing that, like just recognizing that that's like, an experience that could exist and you would still be okay and it would still be worth doing. But I agree. I'd say most people eventually once the power is really discharged around food or whatever, it just does become kind of like, hey, people get used to so much so fast, it's a pandemic. Well, I guess we all live inside now. It does eventually just not have that horror power for most people.
I've actually worked with people who've gotten depressed afterwards because food is no longer like, they don't feel that same rush from food and it's really depressing.
Life is really boring.
Yeah.
Same.
Yeah. And
what do you say to those people?
I'm so sorry. No, but I just spoke to somebody who last year, she's going through it and it's past for her. And I think sometimes it's part of the process. Right. Like rather than now we're depressed all the time because of this. I think it's a part of moving. It's a grief part.
I was going to say, it feels like the letting go process of shit. like I didn't fill my life with anything big enough to handle this. Now that I've given up the one thing, it's like that recognition of like my life is so dull or
Yeah.
small or like lonely, and
Yeah.
just having to deal with that.
Right. But I mean, it doesn't mean that can't change. I don't think it's a life
Right.
sentence.
Absolutely. Anything else that we didn't talk about today that you wanted to talk about? Because I could talk to you forever.
Yeah. Ooh, no, I think, I mean, like, yes and no, like, I mean, we would just keep talking forever. There's so many angles of it. There's like the
Yeah.
anxiety angle and the somatic angle and the
Mhm.
self angle and all of those things. But I
I
feel
wrote
like that's
down
a
learned
lot.
helplessness. Basically, I went through your Instagram and I was like, every post should be a question, but there's no time for all that.
Learned helplessness. Yeah, I was just having a conversation about that yesterday. That's another part. Yeah, of course, where you feel like you're banging your head against the wall. But I think that's part of the the binge restrict cycle, in that when we're constantly trying to solve our binge eating with another way of restricting, like wellness, that's another angle of conversation.
Ooh, yeah.
That essentially you feel like there is no way out, and the way out is actually probably something you never would have considered before, because it's certainly not advocated for or taught about in recovery conversations.
Yeah. Can you come back and do an episode trash talking wellness culture with me? That would be fun.
Anytime.
Okay. So tell people where they can find you. And if you have anything that's like, relevant and you want to share, go ahead.
You can find me on Instagram and Facebook. I have the website, IamStefaniemichele.com, and I run an ongoing binge eating recovery to intuitive eating course. It is intuitive eating aligned, but it is more of a focus on binge eating recovery specifically.
Yeah. Awesome. Everyone listening, you know where to find me, jessieneilan.com or Instagram at jessieneilan. And I just got a TikTok account, so I'm going to figure that out soon. And please come over to my DMs in Instagram and tell me what you thought of this episode, and if you want Stefanie to come back and what topics you want tackled, because I feel like there is so much enthusiasm, I guess is sort of the right word, like so much interest in this topic with food, recovering your relationship with food and stuff, that I feel like people ask me all the time. And because I don't talk about food a whole lot, like I'm always just like, go follow these people, go read these books. But yeah, I if this is of interest to my listeners, I want to bring you back and talk more. So feel free to do that. And other than that, thank you so much, Stefanie, for being here. This was amazing. And to my listeners, I will catch you next week.